Welcome to the Integration Station. I'm Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today again is...
Eleanor. I'm also a child and adolescent occupational therapist. I think I did that bounce off a bit better this time.
You did, yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. I have been practicing that and we've done well with that. So, and each episode we'll be discussing certain topics and how we can best support the young people in our lives, hopefully find the fun in learning these things as well. We'll take your questions, throw on some of our own, and hopefully provide a bit of insight and a bit of discussion. If you have any questions, please send them through to podcast@otfcgroup.au. That's an email. Otherwise, on Instagram, you can send us OTFC group on Insta, I think it is.
We actually had a bonus one come through just as we were about to start recording. So thank you to that person that emailed through, and we will make sure that we get to that next time.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe in the future, it might be even more impromptu and be able to add in some of those questions. But for now, we'll keep that for the next time to give its due diligence and make sure we answer that question as fully as we can, because it was quite a good one. So today's episode, what are we going to cover? A bit about W-sitting. For those that might not know about W-sitting, we'll talk about that. Touch on picky eating. I think sometimes there's a bit of a crossover, say, with other therapists that do work on this stuff. But at the same time, I think we can cover that. But I did want to start with a conversation about dyspraxia. And I got a question that came through, which was, what are some key points for intervention for kids with dyspraxia with low cognition specifically? So what I might do is I might start with dyspraxia in general and then answer the specific question about low cognition.
Good idea.
In a previous episode, we talked about global developmental delay and some of the things that come from that. So some of that will, I think in part, will tie into aspects of what we'll talk about today. But I think this is a huge question. Dyspraxia is a massive thing. And for those that are familiar with OT, it's one of the biggest, I guess, concepts or terms that is thrown around a fair bit in OT. Why? I think it's a lot to do with praxis, and praxis being what our bodies could do. So ultimately, whether that's fine motor skills, gross motor skills, so the finer motor things, your pencils, your cutlery, all those, dressing, or bigger body things, throwing, catching balls, jumping, walking even. Yeah. All those things, there might be differences in how someone is able to perform those tasks compared to someone else. And what we spend a lot of time on in our therapy is understanding what we would term as like expressions of dyspraxia. And so that means we are looking at what are the sensory and motor parts of the body and the brain that are making that person find it harder to do those things. Yeah. And if I'm thinking of praxis, I'm thinking of, the definition of it. And that's why I want to make it really clear, because some people might think of it as something slightly different. Yeah. I don't know, with you, in what, in your assessments or in your therapy, when you think of praxis or supports for kids with dyspraxia, how would you define it, or what sort of things are you looking for in there?
I think if I'm breaking that down, often what I'll say, it's how we purposefully, with intent, plan and execute our movements. So if I'm going to approach a task, I'd be looking at my ideation. Do I actually know how to move my body to action what I need to as part of this? And that's before I've even started doing it. And then you have the next step of actually implementing that motor plan, seeing how that all plays out. And then am I actually getting the feedback from the movement? Is it working? Is it not? Do I have an idea about why it's not working? Can I adjust what I'm doing, make some adaptations, and then approach again? So that's kind of, for me, that whole process. And you mentioned routines before. That's a perfect example of how that's utilised, and the steps, putting all of those things together. And probably when we're talking about dressing tasks, we're thinking, put my pants on, I put my shirt on, but we're thinking, well, how can I move my arm to go through the sleeve of my shirt? And how can I move both sides of my body to actually implement that? There's so many other tasks that go on to then make that successful, or whatever that looks like. And then we also add in, am I actually getting the feedback in the moment from a sensory side of things? Am I understanding, that touch input or movement opportunities that then informing what I'm doing? So bringing in everything all together. You'd asked about that from the specific point of an assessment, actually. And I think we're quite fortunate working in an air sensory integration practice. We have access to assessment tools that really break down these components, including a whole point around those practicabilities. And I find it really interesting. I'm curious to get your thoughts. I feel from the tools that we have available, we're specifically looking at praxis. So we can go from that. This person presents with dyspraxic tendencies, and I can see that in the profile that we've been able to work through as part of this assessment. But it is a term that's utilised a lot, and I often wonder how that accurate assessment is able to be made without having always that really in-depth understanding. It might be a young person that presents as more clumsy or less coordinated, can find it a little bit tricky to pick up new skills or approach new tasks. But is that truly what's the underlying factor that's making that hard, or are there other things at play?
And some people, I'll also mention that some people might know it as, say, like developmental coordination delay or DCD.
Yes.
Sometimes those terms are used interchangeably as well. But you're absolutely right. I think assessment-wise, we are very fortunate and to have access to an assessment that really specifically targets those I guess those elements of what makes up praxis in general, or motor planning, as you might call it more simply. I think if I look at an assessment in whole, it gives me a very clear picture of what that looks like, what those skills look like in practice in that assessment in front of me. But on a day-to-day basis, it can look like clumsiness or avoiding a task. And sometimes people might go, well, they're avoiding, therefore they don't want to do it. Or I go, are they avoiding because they can't?
Yeah.
They're avoiding because their body's not allowing them to do that.
Yeah.
And
or maybe sometimes you see them, they're so willing and wanting to give things a try and seeing what other people are doing, and you're watching how hard they work.
Yeah.
But it's just not coming together as they're hoping for it to.
Yeah.
But then probably a key part of that is you're seeing them do the same things over and over and over without making those adjustments because they're not getting the feedback, or that part in that adaptive response isn't there.
And I think that's a key point. So the question was about low cognition, or kids that may have an intellectual disability or something like that. And for some of those young people, you will see a lot more of they're doing the same thing over and over and over again without a change, because those adaptive responses and the ability to change or plan or to anticipate that something's going to be different here does require a level of cognition.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where it does get tricky. But when I'm working with those younger, higher needs clients that do present with difficulties with praxis, and I was working with a young man yesterday whose praxis is up and down at the best of times, and he's one of my favourite people in the world. What he benefits so much from is repetition. Yeah. Repetition and a play-based approach, so a fun, playful way of doing it. And lots of key words that help almost build a plan. So what I'm doing is saying this there, then that, or first foot, then leg, and really breaking things down, because if I'm thinking about someone who, and you talked about in a previous episode, more language can be quite overwhelming. For someone who might have an intellectual disability or cognitively finds picking up information much more challenging, then if you're able to use keywords, use visuals or model or break things down to very, very chunked and small steps, then what you're doing is you're actually building their plan for them. Yeah. And you're providing them the plan for them to then execute, rather than having to rely on a level of adaptation that can be a lot more complex to do. So in doing so, you're providing this opportunity for this person to learn that skill through the way that you've broken it down and repetition.
Yeah, I think repetition is such a key one. And exactly like you said, that explicit teaching of the skill. Sometimes I guess we might have an idea in our head about what a task should look like.
Oh,
but if
absolutely.
they've got their own way around that and it works for them, I'm all for it.
Well, it's the same as like pencil grip. Like people go, you hold your pencil a particular way, and we all want people to hold tripod and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think you put something up on the social about how Taylor Swift holds her pencil or something like that. Yeah, right. Absolutely. Like there are ways that are, yes, more functional or less strenuous on the hand, but there are also a lot of people that have their own grip and write fine and it works for them, whatever works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think if there is something specific, it might be those splinter skills that we call that, where it's that specific teaching of a certain skill but still providing the opportunities to build foundations in some of those broader skills. I often find for a young person who might be more dyspraxic that the generalizing becomes harder. So let's say you practice an activity in a session and you feel like with that repetition, they really get it. And then the next session you do something and actually the task might look quite similar, but you just change a couple of elements, but the application of that same motor plan becomes really challenging because you changed parts. And so that no longer feels applicable, even though from your perspective you might go, but that's so similar to what we did last week. And I say that because still giving those opportunities is really important. I work with this incredible young person who we spend sessions practicing similar skills. And I was actually just chatting with Mum this week, and I have been observing that I think we are starting to generalize things a little bit more, and we're picking things up that little bit quicker or gaining that fluidity with less repetitions. But that modelling is so important too, because if they're not sure what the plan needs to look like to approach it, showing them what that could look like can be really helpful.
One of my favourite things to do, and I don't do it enough, is to just video it. To get a video of this is what we did in the session, or you want to, that this person has done something fantastic, they've learned how to do a particular task. For young kids, they will spend ages watching videos of themselves, and they love watching videos. Put it on the iPad, phone, whatever, blow it up on the big TV to go, wow, look at them doing that. And in that way, you're actually reinforcing two things. One, like, well done to you. Yeah. So that really positive affirmation, right? Yeah. Celebration, 100%. And then you're also going, well, the byproduct of this is you're seeing how to do this over and over again. So it actually bypasses aspects of the brain that require adaptation and goes straight to this. You have then embedded this motor plan in your brain. So you don't have to think. It's like routines. You know, we talk about routines being, why do they work? Because they're repetitious. Like we do it the same thing over and over and over again. And so you don't have to think about it, because if something changes to that routine, yes, it gets tricky. I get that. But if your routine is pretty consistent and you're able to do that, then you can cruise through. Yeah.
And it's interesting what you said there about that less conscious thought process, because that's the idea. I think as adults, there aren't very many things that we're motor planning and applying those practicabilities from scratch, because there's lots of things that we've done, lots of practice over time. We're able to generalize those things. But for young people who are learning, everything is so new. And we often say that a motor plan is what a skill later becomes. You know, it's the motor planning is the conscious effort. The skill is that more automatic response that you can start able to implement with less of that mental energy to do so. And I love what you said about the video too, the beautiful superhuman I just mentioned before. We did an activity using a swing the other day in the session, and he was so keen for Mum to film it, and I was using quite silly language that he loves. And then the next day we actually had the opportunity to do it again, and he picked it up so quickly. And I turned to Mum like, who is this kid? He is absolutely nailing this. And she actually said that they'd been watching the video in the time in between the sessions, and that obviously really helped solidify things for him. So finding tools like that, especially in the context of this person's question, could be super helpful. Yeah, and there is a scientific approach, video modelling that gets used, that specifically uses that and looks at that as a evidence-based practice. But sometimes a video of you on a playground or in a swing, the evidence is that person just wants to see them do it, and they can learn a lot from that as well. So I think key points, if you're supporting a young person with dyspraxia, especially if it's potentially that low cognition profile, break things down as much as you can into more manageable steps, model that for them so they can see what it looks like, and importantly, give them space and time to repeat that so they can start to solidify that. They might just take that little bit longer. They need extra time to process and cement that. So make sure to provide that. And then find ways that work for them to further cement that, whether it's videoing or using funny language, play into the things that they love to make it motivating, because that's going to help things come together as well. And one more thing, if they have a method that works for them, don't change it. Just go for it. Don't change it. So, from praxis to food. Yes. Picky eating. So I got a question about what are some games or things you can do when a child is more than a picky eater? And I think my first question here when I read this was, what's the age of the child? Because I think sometimes there are generally developmentally appropriate stages of finding your preferences for food. So a lot of kids will, that's why people
always struggle with toddlers and eating because they are figuring out what works
Yeah.
for them. And that
I've
flavour,
got friends that are going through that
right?
at the moment. And
Yeah.
everyone's just like, oh my gosh, things that they loved, they're just not eating anymore. They'll only eat this or in
Correct.
this way.
That happens.
Yeah.
You know, at that stage, that's kids do that stuff, and they find, and also it's very cultural. There are some flavors and senses and a whole bunch of things that some kids in different environments grow up exposed to different things to other food. But if you do have someone with picky, or who is quite a picky eater, one thing that I know, and I'm sure you're aware of it as well, that has come out, that if this is more of a pervasive thing or quite a longer term thing, we obviously see a lot of clients, neurodivergent clients in particular, who have very strong preferences to particular food, whether it's very bland food or whether it's the same type of food, or they know that
It's presented in a certain way.
correct,
Yeah.
or that packet of chip is not the same as the one that they normally eat. So, and that's just this hypersensitivity to those senses. And in some ways, that's quite a skill, if you will, to have those senses so heightened. But I can understand functionally that can be quite challenging. But if a child has very picky food, is very picky with their food, then there has been an introduction of a diagnosis of this called ARFID, which is avoidant restricted food intake disorder, I think, ARFID.
Yep,
yes,
you got it.
Got it. Thank you. It's got the acronym. And that is very much we completely understand that there is a reason as to why this person's not eating food. Not because they don't want to, not because they don't like it, because it's not presented in the right way, but there is a whole bunch of stuff attached to why picky eating is, or eating itself is so hard. And I do empathise with this person, because meal times are a really stressful time.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to be, but they can be.
Yeah.
And so if it comes down to what can I do to make meal times less stressful, that's the question then.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when it comes to picky eating, whilst that might be where that's landing, and there might be sensory preferences with taste, texture, smell, that kind of thing associated, does it actually fit a bit more broadly, like you're suggesting, that actually sitting at the table is really hard? Or I know that my family's going to ask me lots of questions about the day, and I find that format really tough. I'd rather be playing and doing something and chatting in that manner than sitting across the table from someone where that expectation looks a little bit different. So considering those factors as well, I think one of the hardest things can be, if you are trying to encourage your young person to eat something, if we're placing that demand quite strongly and we're saying, you can't leave the table until you eat all of this, or you have to give it a go, just take a bite, that can be really hard. And taking a step back from there might be the place to start.
Yeah, that's sounds like meal times at my house sometimes. And this is where I find it's tricky as a therapist. I'm saying all these things and going, absolutely. And as a parent, I'm going, if you don't eat, you're going to go to bed hungry, and you've got to have something.
No one wants that.
Nobody does, because then you're going to wake up in the middle of the night hungry.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think where this comes into it a bit more, as well as where you've got other therapists that are working on this as well. And so I know a lot of speech therapists and feeding therapists in particular spend a lot of time looking at how we can support what you would call picky eating, or its food preferences or sensory preferences, if you will, that are then impacting on what that person's eating.
I think there's some good resources in terms of where to start. Is it that they can tolerate, thinking about that broader sensory experience, can they tolerate it visually on the table even if they don't want to have it on their plate?
Yep.
Can they tolerate it on their plate even if they're potentially not eating that? Are they happy to explore that using their hands or cutlery without necessarily the demand of an expectation that they'll then eat it? Is that kind of step-by-step process of food exploration
absolutely.
from a sensory lens?
And food play as well. A lot of sensory play can be done with food as well. So it could be playing with spaghetti, it could be playing with different... It doesn't necessarily have to be eaten. It's just understanding and unpacking the sensory preferences of it. And there's one... I'll just make a shout out to a book as well. There's a book I still use it, and I refer it to lots of families. It's called Sensational Mealtimes. And that book was written by a dietitian and an OT. And what they do really well is they talk about what you mentioned about the foundations of arousal and the foundations of how food is quite emotive and how that can lead to particular responses and sensory diets. And sorry, sensory diets not being related to food, but sensory diets as an important way of building someone's sensory systems to make them regulated so that meal times isn't a dysregulating space.
Yes.
And they have recipes and they've got ideas and examples. It's a really useful resource. And it's exactly that. And it comes back to what we talk about all the time is individualizing for that person, for that young person, and trying to find what works for them. So they might be a picky eater, and I understand there are long-term, that there are potential risks of, only eating that type of food, but they also have to eat.
Yes. You've got to get in what works.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that they're meeting some of those nutritional needs as best as you can.
Yeah.
And maybe it's even chatting with, some of your medical team if there's anything they can supplement, if potentially with meeting them where they're at that time.
Correct.
Means that they might need a bit of extra support, multivitamins, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think often we'll say to families that when it comes to picky eating, restricted diets, this is something that does take time to shift. There's no magic bullet or a quick fix overnight. It takes time, and importantly, as we often say, meeting that young person where they're at and exploring with them in ways that feel safe for them, with the intention that quite possibly they might be able to incorporate some different things, but even shifting our expectations about what we want that to look like. If there's a handful of things that they eat, they're probably not going to have, tripled that by, at the end of a year. Maybe even including a couple of new things would be
a
big
goal.
win for that person.
Yeah.
So, just managing expectations. But I really liked the messy play in terms of games. I'm like, get them involved with the cooking. If they're like, are they happy to help you be like in the kitchen, playing with things? In addition to that broader sensory play, do they like playing with shaving cream on your bathroom mirror, or do they like getting in the sandpit or playing in, dried rice, something like that?
I think with my older clients, it's exactly that, is that get involved. Sometimes you'll see more intake or more desire to try things when they're involved in the cooking process.
Yeah.
So make things that they want to make, and sometimes they're willing to try it. Doesn't mean they're going to try everything.
No.
It doesn't mean they'll always try it, but at the same time, regardless, you've made that food a positive experience.
Yeah, I like that. The positive experience, I think, is a really key point. Finally, we've got W sitting. We had a question come through for a 7-year-old who's constantly sitting in a W position. Is this problematic? What is it signifying? What were your thoughts around that?
My first thoughts are, anytime I see W sitting, I always, it's like when you see someone doing the splits and you're like, oh my gosh, how do you get in that position? But W sitting is I see lots of children who W sit, and it comes back to that is their safest, most stable base of support.
Yeah.
The reason they're in that position is because sitting with legs crossed, which also feels quite awkward on the hips, is not as easy to do, or sitting with legs straight, or however else they position themselves on the floor. And just to give you a visual through words, really hard to do on a podcast, but I'll try my best. A W sitting position, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a W sitting position is essentially where their knees are on the floor and their legs are splayed out either side of their knees in this sort of W shape with their legs.
Yes.
And you can think, if you think visually of how wide that base of support is, you can understand why they're adopting that position, because it's a far more stable base than, say, sitting with your bottom, which is very small, on the ground and your legs out wide, and that gives you this sort of teetering effect.
Yeah.
So it makes sense as to why someone might be doing that. Now, the question is, what is it signifying? What is it signifying?
Well, you think about exactly like what you're saying with widening that base of support. When we have difficulties with that core control through your tummy muscles, your back muscles, your neck, when you're sitting on your bottom, your backside more.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah. that really engages a lot of those muscles, and there has to be a strong reliance on that to keep that position without tipping over, slumping to the side, needing to use your hands to support. You might even see them, hugging their knees, because once again, they're just trying to stabilize there. But that W sit really, as you said, widens that base. So those core muscles aren't having to work as hard. And it might mean sitting on the floor, they're able to maintain that position for longer, because sitting cross-legged becomes really tricky. So I often, when I see that, I'm either thinking, wonder if that person needs to work really hard to be on the floor because their core muscles are still developing. Admittedly, though, I think some like it from the sensory experience. It gives a little bit extra through the muscles and the joints. It's like a bit of additional proprioceptive input potentially.
True. I didn't think of that.
So, but more often than not, I'm thinking the core control.
Yeah.
I guess the WSIT in terms of the impact that it's having on some of the joints and things like that, you know, might be a little bit tricky. But I'd probably be looking at that and looking at the bigger picture, that it's not the WSIT itself that's problematic, but potentially the core control.
Yeah.
So that probably means that sitting at the table is really hard, or they appear a little bit more floppy, or there are other things where they're trying to build their skills, like riding a bike is really hard.
You wouldn't recommend a disco seat then for them?
No, because they're going to work so hard against that movement. And then you think about something like those wobble cushions where it gives that bit of feedback. Your body has to constantly switch on different muscles to adjust, and those micro adjustments as well. So for someone that W-sits, they might still be building their capacity to do that. So if I see that on the floor, I might be thinking there's an opportunity here to build that strength, but maybe actually is sitting on the floor really tough for them? Could they be sitting on the chair with back support to the side? And still being able to engage, not working as hard to do that. And then I'd be curious what the flow-on effect might be from there too, if you're able to support them.
And sometimes, as you said, supported seating or bean bags or other things that allow for someone to have a little bit more just sitting in there, and that does provide that proprioceptive input as well. So sensorily you're getting that.
So true.
But you're also understanding that person is really, really working hard trying to keep that base of support. So you're adjusting it to still make it.
Yeah, and their body's just naturally gone for that because they've figured out, if I sit like this, actually that's more comfortable, easy for me to maintain. But is there another opportunity to give them that same practice?
Well, speaking of comfort, my chair's starting to get a little bit sore on my backside too. So I think it's probably
ready for a movement break.
Movement break, and a good time to finish up there. But thank you again, Eleanor, for coming in and answering some of those great questions. Again, to all those who do want to put some more questions in, podcast at otfcgroup.au or OTFC Group on Instagram, and we would be very happy to answer any and as many questions as possible.
Can't wait to see what comes through.
Yeah, in fact, if there's the more the better, because we can get through these faster if we need to, or if you like the longer ones, that's fine. You submit feedback as you wish, and we will listen to what people like. But
thanks everyone.
Thank you, and
shout out to Fletch too.
Of course, as always.
See you later.
See you guys.